Hi everyone, this is Nathan from Snap and welcome to another of our Snap XMP webinars. Today we're going to be looking at adding routing to your questionnaires and forms, helping you gain the data you need from your project. It should take about 30 minutes and as ever there's plenty of further resources which I'll be making available at the end. We'll begin by looking at the three types of routing available in Snap XMP desktop, discussing when one might be used over the others. We'll look at adding some simple routing to an existing questionnaire before moving on to some more elaborate examples, which will hopefully give you some ideas for how your questionnaires and forms might be designed in the future. I should add at this stage that you might be more familiar with the term skip logic or survey branching, but it's all the same thing. And for anyone who's listening in from Australia, apologies for any offence caused, as I'm pretty sure routing means something completely different on that side of the world. I did run a similar webinar last week based around using Snap XMP Online to add in your routing, and I'll be sharing a link for you at the end. I would recommend a watch of that regardless of whether you use Snap Online Builder or not, as I did include some nice examples of routing which can be used in desktop as well. Although I will be using a couple of similar examples, I won't be covering them all today, as I wanted to make sure that I had time to show you some of the more advanced features that the desktop app allows for, with many of these making use of derived variables. A few key benefits to making use of routing. More than anything, it's a way of guiding a participant from start to finish, avoiding them going off on a tangent. In doing so, you can personalise the experience for them based upon their answers given. Because they are being guided, they will avoid answering unnecessary questions, making that process much quicker for them. With that, there's less annoyance and frustration at answering questions which don't seem relevant to them, and that's going to make them more likely to actually get to the end and press submit, which means more data heading your way. And if you haven't annoyed them too much and you are lucky, you may well find that they're willing to participate again in the future. Another potential benefit, depending upon your project, will be the end data pot. Often when looking at existing client surveys, I've come across multiple versions of the same survey, where a survey's been cloned and then tweaked as they need different participants to see slightly different things. This then means that a master survey needs to be created to enable the data to be analysed together. By having it as one larger survey, one routed larger survey, the analysis stage gets that much easier. It also means that you're dealing with one link for the questionnaire form rather than multiple links for different forms. It may well be that you end up producing a number of different seeded links which are based upon the original link. That way you can take the participant down the correct route without asking them to decide which route they want to go. So again, making the end product more efficient and also less prone to mistakes because you are deciding which route they're going to be taking. Okay, let's head into the software and look at how routing can be used to enhance your data collection. I'm going to start by looking at a very simple questionnaire which has got 3 questions at the start. Based upon the way that these 3 are answered, the participant will be directed off to the next relevant question or section. There's 3 different types of routing which can be applied to a question, and these 3 questions will allow me to demonstrate all 3 routing types. I'll click on the first question and click on the routing icon. We can also just right click and choose routing from the right click menu. And let's have a look at the 3 different types of routing. So conditionally asked question. Here we are specifying when a question will pop up or appear. A simple example might be a question around smoking. It could be set to appear if the participant has previously said that they were over the age of 11. Go to on answer. Here we're saying that based upon the response to a set of potential answer choices, the participant will then be directed to the next relevant part of the form. So at its simplest, if they say yes, go to Q2, and if they say no, go to Q3. And then we have go to after question. There might be questions where it really doesn't matter how the respondent answers the question. Regardless of whether they answer A, B, C or D, the next relevant question is X. And this type of routing just means that you don't have to put routing on each of the answers, you instead just apply it to the entire question. So let's put this into action. To make it a bit more realistic, I have got a couple of questions at the beginning, separated by a page break, and then question 3 is going to be the first of the questions which we're going to be routing. For question 3, I'm going to apply routing to take them to question 4 or question 5, depending on which answer they give. And before I go and set this up though, I'm going to pop into the paper edition down the bottom. And the reason being is that when you set up your routing, it tends to be hidden in the online editions, as there's no need to tell the participant what to do. The form's going to be jumping from question to question, whereas on a paper questionnaire, it's visible, as obviously you need to tell the participant where they need to go next. So viewing your routing on the paper edition just means it's easier to see what has and hasn't been set up. It's also easier as you can more clearly see which questions are which, based on the question numbers. But to confirm, routing is functionality rather than formatting, and as such it really doesn't matter which edition it is that I'm clicked on when we set up the routing, it's going to be applied to all the different editions. So sticking with question 3, if I go up to the routing icon, and we will add, and our first job is to decide which of the 3 different routing types to choose from. Now, if I instead cancel out of that menu and start by clicking on the first answer, which is yes, and then go up to my routing, Snap will actually make some decisions for me because it will work out what we're doing. So this time I will add, and you can see it's already selected go to an answer, and it knows that I'm clicked on the first answer, which is yes. So if I click OK, we're then simply selecting a target where they're going to go to. So in my case, I want them to go to question 4. Below that we have some text. That is what will appear on the actual piece of paper, and you can see it will only appear on the paper copy. You could force it to also appear on the online versions or never to ever appear, but really it's only the paper copy that we want that to appear on. And that's it. Our routing's all set up. We do now need to specify what will happen when they click no. So we will click add. You can see it's already jumped onto the second answer. And this time we're going to send them off to question number 5. If there was more answers, I would just simply click on the add and add some more. But as there aren't, I will click OK. You can see we have some blue text and a blue arrow. That will disappear when it's printed off. Ultimately, the fact that it's blue means that it's happy. You can see if I was to move this question down the page, some of my routing goes pink because I'm not able to jump backwards. And equally, if I was to add a new question, you can see whereas before it was saying go to Q5, it's now saying go to Q6. So your routing's all dynamic. It's not attached to text. It's actually attached to a particular question, and it will update itself accordingly. I'm just going to undo those 2 changes. Looking at question 4. So this question will be asked of anyone who said yes to being in education. So from an analysis perspective, knowing which school group we're in is obviously quite important. From a questionnaire flow perspective, I really don't care which answer they give, just as long as they have answered a question. So as long as they've answered this question, the next relevant question for them is going to be question number 6. So rather than specifying that if they click preschool, go to Q6, and if they click infant school, go to Q6, and then the same for junior and senior school, it's much quicker to say after this question, go to question 6. So again, if I go up to my routing icon and add, and we're going to say after this question, go to. As before, just selecting the target, and this time Q6. As before, we get the text in blue, but this time it's held in the footnote of the question rather than at the side. The third and final bit of routing will be applied to question 5, and here we're going to specify when a particular question will be asked. Now, I said it was going to be applied to question 5. It's actually going to be applying it to question 5a, which is the please specify. So in my example, I only want this showing if they've answered other. So we'll be making use of conditionally asked question. This time we aren't jumping down, so there's no drop-down menu to select. Instead, we have the if statement, and in there we can simply type question 5 equals 5, and 5 relating to option number 5 in that list. Okay, we've added some simple routing to our questionnaire. I mentioned about doing this in the paper copy rather than the online edition. If I do pop back into my online edition, and this is the PC laptop edition, you can see it doesn't look like we have the routing set up, but if I go into question 1 and click on the routing icon, we can see it is then visible. So much easier setting up your routing in the paper edition. Let's have a look at what we've done by running a preview. I'm just going to run the preview. So as I said, I've got just a couple of questions to begin with. So if I say yes, that I'm in education, I can then specify which school group I'm in and then move on to the comment question. If I change it to no, the school question disappears and the employment question pops up. Now, from a testing perspective, you can see that it's useful having this all on one page because we can see whether it's working or not. From an actual participant flow perspective, you might consider popping a page break in between these questions. And I guess really that just depends on what the question is and who's going to be viewing those questions and whether it matters that they see a question and then it disappears. But as I said, from a testing perspective, it's actually quite handy. Now I'm going to leave it on the no, and this time I'm going to say other, and you can see the please specify pops up underneath. So at its simplest, you can see that routing is just about making sure that participants have access to the questions that they need to see and they skip over any content that isn't relevant to them. Before we move on to look at some more elaborate examples, I just wanted to show you a relatively new feature which can be used alongside routing to make your questions flow that little bit smoother. So moving back into Snap. Now, at the moment, my please specify is popping up below the tick box selection boxes. Instead, I'm going to get this please specify to pop up alongside the other box. So we're going to make use of something called inline questions. And just remember that this is question 5 and that's question 5a. So I'm going to insert a variable field and we're going to make use of question 5a, and I'm going to take that as an inline question. Now, just to make this read a little bit more naturally, I'm just going to add a colon and a space. And I think this works really well if you've got a number of different sort of please specify options relating to different tick boxes. So I'm actually going to add one additional sort of please specify. Going to be what is the company name? And I'm going to pop that to appear alongside the director and office holder. This time it's going to be Q5B, again as an inline question. And just remembering that we'd probably want to set this to pop up only if they tick the director office holder. So again, the routing is going to be popping up on the condition, and this time that question 5 equals 4, so the 4th answer in that list. Okay, let's save what I've done, and again we'll just run a quick preview. Again, I'll say that I'm not in education. We can tick some different options. And the idea here really is that the focus remains where you've selected. You're not having to tick director and then move down the page to give additional options. And as I said, I think this works really well where you have got a number of different selection boxes relating to a number of different open boxes. Okay, let's have a look at some slightly more interesting uses of routing. So got a shortcut for a survey here. And here we've got a form with a variety of pop-up messages to give information and also sometimes warnings to the participant of any issues with the data that's just been input. Initially, it's a form taking on the example that maybe it's an on-site audit with perhaps some sort of face-to-face interviewing. I'll state that I haven't seen evidence of the well-known section 875 or article A42. and that the money printing machine is cleaned on a monthly basis, and that I saw 3 members of staff in the foyer. At the very end of this very short audit, I'm then presented with a number of things which have been flagged up, and in my case, all 3 things have been flagged up. If I go back and say that there were 5 members of staff in the foyer, and perhaps I did see evidence of section 875, we can see 2 options disappear, and I'm then just left the warning message about the money machine not being cleaned regularly. Again, if I was to go back and select daily, I'll get a message to say that we're pleased to say that there's no issues found. As mentioned, I think this works really well if you're perhaps sitting down with a colleague or client answering questions along the way, and then you want to have a final review section at the end, with the form acting as the knowledge base. And it means that really the person asking the question doesn't need to have an in-depth knowledge of what's right and wrong, because the form's providing that information for them at the end. Next, I want to check that the date being entered tallies with another date. It could be that it's a follow-up survey which should only be completed so many days after an event has taken place, or checking perhaps arrival versus departure dates, etc. In my example, I'm taking the scenario that a complaint has been filed, but someone's then filling in a follow-up complaint form, but users should really be waiting at least 4 days between the first form being completed and then sending in a follow-up form. So I will initially state that I first reported the issue tomorrow. Now, obviously that's not possible because I can't say that I reported something tomorrow because that's in the future, so I get a system warning pop up. If I then specify actually it was yesterday, I have a survey form message popping up telling me that actually this form can only be done if the original form was completed 4 days ago. If I try to move on, I get a warning message, a system warning telling me to check the response and try again. So it works a little bit differently from the audit style information messages that we saw before, because in those ones I could simply press next to move on regardless, where here I can't move on until I correct the error. If I go through and say actually I first reported it a long time ago, it does let me move on. We then end with a bit of a quiz or test with either a try again, or I say 22, I get a correct message. So here I've got this message appearing on screen, and really that's just a personal choice, and it will depend whether you want people seeing messages as they sort of start entering data, or is it better, like in this next example, so what 3 words or phrases were used in our recent social media campaign. So first of all, if I try and do 4, it doesn't let me. So if I just reset that, try to choose a few different ones and press next, the error message or the warning message is on the next page, and please go back. Whilst if I hopefully get it right, then I'm taking off to a different message, and this time I've actually popped a video in there. To be honest, it's a video completely unrelated to this quiz, but more just to highlight that you can pop videos into your messages as well. So let's have a look at this in Snap. So if I close down this survey, I'm going to open up the pop-ups and warning messages survey. So first of all, we have a set of questions which are then followed up with the notifications at the bottom, or the observations. So I've got a message which is a note variable, which will be displayed if all the answers were positive. So you can see it's actually, in my example, it's just a subtitle, and I have some routing on here that says if the answer to question 1 was yes, so we did see evidence of section 875, and they cleaned the money machine at least weekly or bi-weekly, and there were 4 or more people in the foyer, then they're going to get a positive message saying there's no issues found. We then have 3 different messages which are more specific to where there are issues. And you can see I have a message, basically a bit of a header. So if any of these were effectively wrong, then we're going to get this header and then the individual messages popping up, obviously, as and when. So this one will pop up if they said no to question number 1, which was about section 875. This one popping up again on the condition, so conditionally asked question, that they chose 3 to 5 for question 2, so that's anything longer than bi-weekly. And then if there was any less than 3 members of staff, or in fact any less than 4 members of staff, so less than or equal to 3, then this message will pop up about the staff presence. These messages were just for reference, so the participant or interviewer in this case could just move on and move past those messages. In the next example, if the data was incorrect, then they weren't able to move on. They had to sort of correct it before they could progress any further. So if we initially look at the routing on this message, so you can see it's based on a calculation. id.date is the date that the link was clicked, so in my case that was today, and question 4 is the date question just above that. So you can see it's saying id.date is less than whatever date was in there plus 4 days. So the routing stating that the message will pop up if today's date is less than 4 days later than the date that they entered. Now, apart from the fact that it is doing a calculation within this routing, the other thing which differs is that my message is actually on a single choice question rather than a note. And the reason for doing that is it means that I can set that single choice question to be a must answer question, so a compulsory question. However, what I've actually done is go into the show option and I've actually turned off the tick box or the code box. So it's a must answer question, which actually it's impossible to answer. So whenever that message pops up, they can't move on until they've answered it, but of course they can't answer it. So the only way to move on is to effectively get rid of that message by correcting the issue. I've also made the pop-up green just to make it stand out. So I've just gone to background of the text and just added a background color just to make it stand out a little bit more. Now, depending upon your reason for a message such as this one, it might be that actually it's more relevant to use a screen out. But again, that would depend why this message is popping up and I guess at what stage in the form this message is popping up. For my test section, I've got a couple of note variables per question. So for question number 6, I've got sort of that's not correct and that is correct. So the routing is popping up to say if there's anything less than 4, so basically 1, 2 or 3 or 0, then that's going to pop up, whilst the correct message will pop up if they've typed a number of 4 or more, so greater or equal to 4. So that one was popping up sort of instantly on screen. As I said, it may well be that it's better to have perhaps a page break in between your warning messages. So in my example, first of all, this was where they had to choose 3 options and the 3 correct options. As soon as they choose any of the wrong answers, so as soon as they put an answer in number 2 or 3 or 4, even if they've got 2 of the 3 right but got 1 of them wrong, then that error message is going to pop up. And the correct message will only pop up if they've selected all the different things. So this time using and rather than or comma. And this was the one where I also added or inserted some custom HTML, so just using the insert button. And I've just basically taken the embedded YouTube link and pasted it into here. That's custom HTML. Now, with the date question just a moment ago, I used a calculation within the routing expression. Let's have a look at a few more examples of the sorts of routing that can be introduced by including a derived variable into an expression. So I'm going to open up one more survey. This one's called In Survey Calculations. So here I have a couple of open-ended comment questions, actually quantity response questions, and I've set them up to display as slider controls, and then I have a note variable underneath, and that's set to pop up if there's a certain number of people that are then going to trigger a discount. Now, I've actually got two derived variables involved here, one called party size, which is effectively adding up the answer of these two questions, and then another one called party discount, which is working out based on the party size, what sort of discount can we expect. So let's just have a look at those two derived variables. So we've got question 1a and question 1b, and if I go into my variables window and initially look at party size, so here you can see it's simply taking question 1a and 1b, they're both quantity response questions, adding them together with a plus, and that's giving me a total, so party size. If we then look at party discount, I'm then taking the data from party size and specifying what discount they're going to get. So if there's any less than 11 people, they're going to get a 10% discount. If there's less than 21 people, 20% discount, etc., etc. The final 40% discount is for if there's a party size of 30 or more. But just notice that I've effectively rooted out anyone who has a party size of less than 6. So if there's 5 or less, actually they're not going to be getting any discount. So party discount is the name of this derived variable. And if we go back into the design window and look at my routing, so this message is due to pop up if effectively they're due a party discount. If they're not due a party discount, doesn't matter whether they're due at a 10%, 20%, 30 or 40%, just as long as they're due some kind of discount, then this will pop up. Alternatively, I could have based this routing on perhaps party size. I could have said party size greater than 5. But yeah, okay, just useful when it really doesn't matter which category they ticked, just as long as they have kind of been active within that variable. Moving on to the next page. Here I've got a number of sets of different images. So I've got an image about gift shop, scooter hire, there's actually 4 in total, water station and medical tent. But I only want each participant to see one of these. And I'm going to be making use of a power data variable called id.start to determine which of those 4 question sets will display. Now, if I open up a derived variable called time, so this is one that I've created. So it's a single response derived variable, and it's making use of id.start second. Now, that's effectively separating the seconds out from the minutes and the hours of a particular time. And you can see I've actually separated mine out into effectively 15-second segments. So if id.start second is less than 15, they're going to go into the first section. If it's less than 30 seconds, but they haven't already been taken out due to the first 15 seconds, then there'll be the second section, etc., etc. And then the last one just is true, which is basically take anyone that didn't fall into one of the first categories. So basically, when someone clicks on the link, Snap will look at the time that they clicked on that link and specify which of these 4 categories do they belong to. So that's called time. And if we look at the questionnaire, you can see the routing on the gift shop is if time equals 1. Same with the sort of follow-on questions, time equals 1. And then the next section is time equals 2 and time equals 3, etc. We do have a similar sort of feature called randomize, but that's all about displaying a set of questions in a random order, whereas today I'm using time to specify which of those sets will display. One final example to show you, and then we'll preview these to see the calculations in action. Now, you might have a scenario where you wish to add up a number of answered questions or the number of correct answers to a set of questions. In my sort of rather crude example, I've got a group of questions where I'm going to be allocating a point based on a correct answer. So for this first set of questions, it's going to be if they choose every day. And actually for the last question, it's going to be if they choose the second one. And then for the middle questions, ultimately, I don't really care which answer they give, just as long as they have answered those questions. Again, I'm going to be allocating some points. And then based upon those points, I'm going to be specifying, are they doing well? Are they doing okay? Or do they need to work a little bit harder? So first of all, let's have a look at the derived variable which is doing my calculations. So I have a derived variable called total score. Now this is a quantity response derived variable, and it's making use of a word called num. Now I'm actually going to pop back into my PowerPoint just to sort of blow this up and make it a little bit easier to read. So I've got lots of mini expressions separated by a number of pluses which are adding all those expressions together. And I'm using the word num, and num's got various uses in an expression, but today if we take it as though it means if. So here we're saying if the response to question 1a was option number 1, then give it a point. And then if the response to question 11b was number 1, then give it a point, etc., etc., for all the 11a, b and c. And you can see it's adding the 3 together with the plus symbol. Moving on to the next part. This was where we're making use of the OK again. So again, we don't really care what option they choose, just as long as they have answered a question. Now in this example, I'm going to allocate 3 points, so star 3. So if question 12a was answered, and question 12b was answered, and question 12c was answered, so if all 3 of them were answered, then it's going to be given 3 points, again added to the previous expression, the points. And then for the final section, if question 13 was answered, give it a point, and if question 14 was answered with option number 2, then again give that a point. So effectively there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 points on offer if each of these answers were given correctly. So moving back into Snap, if I go back into the design window, so we can see if I look at the routing for great, so if the total score is more than 6, so basically 7 or 8, then we're going to get a message pop up. If the score was somewhere between 4 and 6, we're going to get a message saying we're doing okay, but we need to keep going. And if the score is effectively less than 4, so basically if it's a score of 3, then we're going to get a message saying we need to work a bit harder. Now I have got some other routing on there, which is basically is to stop this message popping up too soon. Again, we could get around this by making sure that there was a page break on there, but in my case today I wanted to have this on the same page, so I only wanted this to be active once they've at least started typing some of the questions in. If not, as soon as we go onto this page, they're going to get a message saying we need to try harder when they haven't even started. Okay, now if I do just quickly pop back to the PowerPoint. So here we were adding all the scores together. Often when we're looking at scoring systems, sometimes we want to work out then averages. So another option would be to pop it all in brackets. So I've got a bracket at the beginning, bracket at the end, and then to divide it by the possible number of questions. So that's another option you could look at doing. But let's go and run that preview. And we can see how all our calculations are coming together. So first of all, as I said, these are quantity response questions. I have got the option just to type a number in there, but the idea really is that they can slide along. You can see at the moment I've got 12 in total, so it's popping up a message because I've got more than 5. It's calculated that 11 people in total, and that will give me a 20% discount. Or if I start increasing my numbers, you can see it's gone up to 30%, all the way up to 40%. Moving on to the next question. Remember this, we've got 4 different potential images which might pop up, and based upon the time that I click the link, it'll be looking at the seconds. So did I click the link at 10 seconds past the minute or 50 seconds past the minute? At the moment I have the medical tent popping up. If I was to go back and just restart this questionnaire. So 15 seconds has passed, so we've now got the gifts shop. Now, from a testing point of view, I've got the restart button on there just to help me test the timer. Equally, I've also got the back button. If this was a test, you might decide to remove the back button. But certainly, again, from a testing point of view, it's useful a bit to do all this in one go without having to click on different multiple links. moving on to the final page, if I start giving some responses, you can see at the moment I've only got 2 points. So again, you might decide this works better if this was on a separate page. I start putting in my words. Got 5 points. If I go and choose 7 points, you can see it's calculating it as we go along. As I said, realistically, we might consider putting a page break between these, but again, just from a testing point of view, it's useful having without the page breaks initially. I thought I'd end with a couple of hints and tips. I mentioned at the very start the idea of setting up your routing on the paper questionnaire, just so it's easier to see what's been set up. Something else quite useful is to open up the variables window. And if I go into Tailor, I can also turn on my routing and masking. Now, this can be really useful if you're sometimes trying to delete a question and Snap tells you that you can't delete it because it has dependents. So here we can see where our routing is. Now today I've only got conditional routing on this questionnaire, which is why we've only got data in the not asked column. If we had go to on answer, or after this question go to, then we'd have data populated in the go to and skip by column as well. We can also click on a particular question. So I'm on the total score. If I go to sources and dependents, we can see that that derived variable is based on question 11, A, B, C, etc. And it's being used in N6, N7 and N8. So again, if we delete that total score, we're going to have issues with some of these other follow-on questions. Another useful time saver is when you want to apply the same routing to a collection of questions, so perhaps a grid or maybe a whole section of the questionnaire. So for example, today I have the gift shop section. Now I might want to apply the same routing to all of those 3 questions, but if I highlight all 3 questions, you can see the routing icon disappears, grays out. So the way around that is to apply the routing as per normal, which I've already done. So time equals 1. If you then right click on that question and go to variable properties, we then have routing in here, but in a slightly different format. It's actually kind of back to front. So it now, rather than saying when will it appear, it now becomes a bit of a negative. So when will it not appear? So it's not going to appear unless time equals 1. So it's basically just reversed. So I can copy that text. I can then highlight whatever questions I want to into variable properties. And it's obviously there already because I've already set this routing up, but I can then paste it into there. We could then maybe grab a completely different section into variable properties, paste it into there, but perhaps change my routing to number 2. So yeah, just useful if you want to apply the same routing to multiple questions. Okay, so hopefully that's provided you with a good introduction to routing, taking you through the very basics of using 3 types of routing through to a nice few examples of how you might make your questionnaires and forms more efficient. A parting gift or two. When setting up your routing, you do need to consider the unusual ways in which your respondents might answer, making sure you've allowed for all the different pathways that a participant might get to a particular section. So think about the question text and header text that's used in any follow-up questions. Does it work if they come from route A, but does it also work if they're coming from route E? So do we instead need to perhaps think about different messages further down the field, or making sure that our messages aren't too specific, so they're less specific and more generic? And the best way to try and do this is really to try and get into the mindset of the different participants and sort of role play the different situations. On screen now are a few QR codes which will take you off to some additional resources, which includes the Support Hub page for routing in Snap XMP desktop, as well as a useful routing expressions page, which includes things like the meaning of num, etc. that we used earlier. As mentioned, I did run a similar webinar last week, which was based around setting up your routing in Snap XMP online instead. Although there was a little bit of crossover in what I did today, there's lots of additional examples which I think you will find useful, or at least thought-provoking. And although they were set up obviously in that webinar in Snap XMP Online, they can all be replicated in desktop as well. And if you have got a spare 2 minutes, if you wouldn't mind just completing our short questionnaire about today's webinar, I'd really appreciate that. That can be found using the QR code on the right. You can also access the link in the chat of this Teams call. Thank you for joining me, and we will hopefully see you again soon.